Hi, Justin with Spalted Stag Studio, and in this video I'm going to be building a massive built-in hutch. I started by using a cutlass optimizer to efficiently lay out all my pieces. This project used a ton of plywood, so it was really important that it was laid out with the program to minimize waste. I also oversized each piece. That way when I cut a specific set of pieces, I can do so without moving my fence to ensure that they're all the exact same size. This hutch is going to be built in between two walls, and I have a very tight tolerance with almost no room for error. There will be 10 pieces of plywood that will be between the two walls that make up the cabinet of the hutch. So I'm going to take 10 pieces of scrap plywood, compress them together on my vise, and take a measurement. I'll then compare this to the plan's measurements. On the plans, I have it at 3/4 of an inch. However, plywood is never 3/4 of an inch, so this will give me an idea how much I need to adjust my plans so it fits in perfectly. The client requested that everything be incredibly sturdy, so I decided to use dados on this build. I could have used pocket screws or even the domino, but I think the dados are going to offer the most support. The upper and lower dados are going to be the full length of the plywood. The center two dados are going to be in about 4 inches. So I'm going to use the dado blade to make a mark. That way I ensure that it's the same on all pieces of plywood. After making those cuts with the dado blade, I can use those marks as a reference point for my jig and use my router to clean everything up. Again, this is going to make sure that these dados are in the exact same spot on each piece of plywood. It's going to make setting this jig up much faster. And it's also a lot easier on the router bits because you're moving a lot less material with them. Next, I'll use a 1/2 inch piece of scrap wood to set the distance for my dado blade. This will give me a perfect distance for the nailer, that way it sits in nice and snug. The dado method made assembling these cabinets an absolute breeze. Everything clicked together as it should, everything was square, and we really didn't have any issues other than one, which I'll get to in a little bit. Normally I use dominoes for projects like this, and while in my opinion they are much more efficient than something like pocket screws, I do run into the occasional issue. Most of the issues I run into are because I tend to put too much glue into the mortise. This will prevent the domino from seating properly, and I have to apply a bunch of force to get it to clamp together. When I'm using hardwoods, normally I'm able to do that and I just have a ton of squeeze out. However, when I'm doing plywood, it tends to actually blow out the other side of the plywood and could potentially ruin a project. So moving forward, I think I'm going to actually stick to using the dado method because I was really impressed with how everything went together. The issue that we did have was with the back of the cabinet. When I set the dado blade up, I used a piece of 1/2 inch scrap to set the appropriate width for the dado. Did a bunch of test cuts until I had about a 1/16 inch of room to play, and that's what I committed to. However, when I went to assemble the first cabinet, the back didn't fit. So I learned the hard way that when you make dados like this and you're working with plywood, test multiple pieces to make sure they all fit because there can be some deviation in the plywood. I did a mock assembly of the cabinets so I could take some measurements and build my toe kick. I ended up choosing to do a double layer of 3/4 inch ply for this toe kick, which is honestly overkill. A single layer probably would have been fine. However, I wanted to be absolutely sure that this could bear the weight of not only the hutch, but all the pieces that they will be putting on this hutch. I chose to use the domino to build this toe kick because this thing's over 11 foot long, and it's really important that everything remains flush during assembly. Since everything's going to be built off this one piece, any kind of deviation is going to make installation of the hutch much more difficult and time consuming. Mise en place, which means everything in place, is a very important skill set that I learned when I was cooking, and this transfers into pretty much every aspect of my life. It's really important that I stay organized. It prevents me from losing things, prevents me from wasting material, and makes me a more efficient woodworker. And that's one of the things that made this build stressful. This thing was massive and took up a good portion of my shop. I had to constantly move things around my shop to accommodate for the size, which then made me feel like I was cluttered and I wasn't working efficiently as I should be. As I edit this video, I see multiple things on my workbench that really have no business being there, and it's kind of driving me a little crazy. All these pieces should have been put back in their place and out of my way as I assembled this. There's really no excuse to work in a cluttered environment like this. Next up, I'll be assembling the face frame. I'll be using the domino for this process as well, and it's going to be really important that the face frame is relatively sturdy. I don't want any seams in the final workpiece, so the face frame is going to be one single piece, and again, it's going to be a little over 11 feet long. I also got to use the rail attachment for the domino for the first time, and I was very, very happy with it. It definitely saved me a ton of time in this step. For the most part, the glue up was pretty straightforward and went very well. The only thing that I ran into an issue with was the length of it, which was expected because it's quite a bit longer than my workbench. I already had some stands set up to assist with this. However, because of the height of it, there was still a little bit of flex when I was gluing it together, which kind of worried me a little bit. I was worried that it was either going to split a glue joint or was going to actually break a piece of the wood and I'd have to start over. Thankfully, though, nothing happened. And in the future, if I do something this big, I'll definitely make sure I'm a little bit more considerate in how I prepare for this. Unfortunately, the layout of the client's house will prevent me from installing this lower part of the cabinet as one unit. It's going to have to be taken apart and reassembled at the location. So I'll be using some dominoes to help align the face frame back to its appropriate position. And again, this is only for alignment purposes, so I only want to install these in the top. I'll use another method to secure the rest of the frame to the cabinet. For the upper shelves, I'll be gluing on a piece of 1/8 inch thick maple. This is going to offer a lot more durability than the press-on edge banding, and in my opinion, it looks a lot better. I am really not a fan of the press-on edge banding. It just doesn't sand well. You can't put a round over on it without seeing the plywood through that, and it offers almost no durability whatsoever. So again, in my opinion, this is the better route, even though it does take more work. Once the glue dried on all the shelves, I took it over to my router table and cleaned everything up with a flush trim bit. Now this doesn't get it perfect, but it gets it close enough to clean up with a sander, and your glue joint almost disappears. Any gaps will get filled in with wood filler before I prime and paint. The sides of the upper cabinet are a much simpler process. I'll start this by cutting 3 3/4 inch dados and 1 3/4 inch rabbet. That'll be for the 3 shelves and the top of the unit. I'll then switch to a 1/2 inch dado blade and run a 1/2 inch dado for the back of the cabinets. Unfortunately, I completely forgot to make these brackets before I switched everything over to that 1/2 inch dado. So I had to take everything apart and build everything back up to 3/4 of an inch. I'm just using these brackets to hold the shelves as I paint them. Not only will this help give me some elevation off my table so no wet paint gets on the shelves, it's also going to stop paint from getting into the areas that are going to actually be glued to the sides. And they're nothing fancy, they're just cut to the length of the shelves, and it's all scrap wood, so I wasn't out really any material. The client also requested to have holes cut into each shelf so she could pass electrical cords through them. I started by using an 1/8 inch drill bit to drill a pilot hole. That way I can come from each side with my Forstner bit and eliminate any possibility of tear out. As you can see, I'm using stop blocks and my fence. However, the table always seems to move. No matter how much I torque everything down or what kind of preventative measures I put in place, if this table gets bumped, it moves. So I'm always careful to mark everything. That way I'm sure that nothing moved, and then I'm drilling the hole in the proper place. Once I get the pilot holes drilled, I'll switch over to a 1.5 inch Forstner bit. And since we're drilling the hole from both sides, we don't really need to worry about how deep we drill in the first time. Because once we flip it over, we'll just drill until it pops out. Once I get all the holes drilled, I'll put an 1/8 inch roundover bit into my router, and I'll use that to break the corners of the hole. This not only makes it easier for the electrical cords to pass through, but it'll prevent the paint from chipping on a sharp corner. These dovetail jigs are made in a way that they can be adjusted for any size drawer. However, that process is pretty tedious and you have to be absolutely sure that your board is centered in between the pins. To streamline this process, we can measure the distance in between two of the pins, and in this case, that measurement is 1 inch. Now moving forward, we can design all our drawers in inch increments. Once we do the initial setup and center our board, we won't ever have to do that again as long as we follow that rule, keeping the drawers within the inch increments. Unfortunately, my deadline for this project approached very rapidly, and I didn't get much footage of assembling the drawers, installing the drawers, or building the drawer faces. With that being said, the next segment of the video will be us installing the hutch. I don't really have too much to say on this. Again, this was a very tight deadline, and I had to focus on actually doing the job and not so much going over each process. So I apologize that I didn't get into much details, but here I'll stop talking and just let you enjoy watching the install process. And there we have the 11-foot by 8-foot built-in hutch. I apologize that I skipped over some segments, and I didn't apply too much detail to the video. This was by far the largest project I've ever done, and I really needed to apply my thought process to actually building this, and not so much making a video. Anyways, I hope you still enjoyed watching, and if you could take the time to like and subscribe, I would really appreciate it.